Today we're going to show how to make the unit circle and then make tangent, sine, and cosine based on the unit circle. So the first thing we're going to need is a circle with radius. So you click on that. Now you need to make sure you're on the origin. So x-axis and y-axis should come up. You just click. And you want radius 1. And if you're too zoomed out or zoomed in, just zoom in so it'll be your desired view screen. Now what we need to do is make a slider, because this slider is going to represent our angle that is going to be created from the origin and the x-axis to the point on the circle. So I do 1080, so it'll go around 3 times. I'm going to unfix the slider so I can move it over here. Now what we need to do is make an angle with given size, but before we can do that we need 2 points. So I'm just going to put another point on the x-axis in the circle, so it'll have length 1. So when we create our angle with given size, it'll be on the unit circle. So our angle is going to be alpha, because that's what our slider was. So now when we move this slider, it moves the point around the circle. So now what we're going to do is we're going to create a point on the x-axis that represents the length to make a triangle, like this. So what we want to do, before I do this, I'm going to put the input bar up top to make it easier to see. So what we want to do is make a point with the x value of b prime. But before I do that, I'm going to change b prime's name to c to make it a little easier to tell between b and c. So we need an x coordinate of c now. GeoGebra will just do that for you if you just type in x parent of c, comma 0, because our x value is going to be x of c, and we always want the y to be 0. So if I hit enter, now it creates this point D for us, and if we notice, it'll always be the x value of c, which we can also think about as being cosine of alpha, because the radius is 1. So now I just create a triangle by connecting C, A, and D. So now I've got the unit triangle as it moves around the circle. And I'm going to hide the segments because I don't need to see them. So now that I've got this, I can start to make sine and cosine. So the first thing I need to do is make another window. So I'm going to go to View to Graphics 2, and that'll put another graphics window just so it doesn't get cluttered. I'm going to zoom out of this one to make more room for this. So I'm going to zoom out to like there. Scoot this over. So now what I want to do is I want to change this window, because for sine and cosine and tangent we graph it with our inputs not being real numbers but being degrees, or we'll do it in radians. So you go to Options, Advanced, Preferences, Graphics 2, X-axis, and then where it says unit, you're going to type in, we could do degrees, but I want to do it in radians, so we're going to click pi. And then for distance, I want it in pi over 2 segments, so it'll break it up for me. And I just hit enter. So now I've got it represented in radians by real numbers, but I don't need it to go to 5 or to -5, so I'm going to change that as well. So if you go back to the preferences and go to basic, your x minimum, we'll put it like -2, and my maximum, I'm actually going to put it like 20, so we can get a good range of motion. Or we don't need to 20, we'll just do 15. And for the y minimum, we only need to go to -1, so I'll go to -2. And for the y maximum, we only need to go to 1, so I'll go to 2 just to give us a little window. So now you've got this window right here. Now to graph sine and cosine, we know that cosine on this unit triangle is going to be the x value of this triangle, because cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. and we know our hypotenuse is 1. So the adjacent of this length is going to be the x value of it. And we already know from making the unit triangle that it's going to be x of c. But what are our inputs for the coordinate points here? We're going to be putting in degrees or radians, so our input point is going to be alpha. And then our output is going to be x of c. So our input was alpha, because it's how many degrees we are, and then our output is going to be whatever cosine is at that degree. So if I hit enter, it'll appear right here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into object properties, and I'm going to put the trace on, and I'm going to make it a color. I'm going to make cosine red, and it's in graphics too, so I hit enter. Now if I move this, you can see it trace out cosine. See, we start at 1, and at pi over 2 we're 0, at pi we're -1, and so on. So we have cosine traced out now for us. I'm going to scoot this over just a little more. Yeah, so we get a little more range. Okay. So that's cosine. Now let's do sine. It's going to be almost the same thing. Our input's going to be alpha, just like cosine. But our output, instead of being the x value of the unit triangle, we want the y value of the unit triangle, or the height. So that's going to be given as y of c, which is the height of c. If you hit enter, let's see where it put it. If you go to object properties, they put it in graphics 1, so we got to make sure it's in graphics 2. Then we're going to go to color, and I'm going to make it blue. And then I'm going to put the trace on and hit enter. So now it's right here. And if we move this, we can see the blue one, which is sine, being traced out. So one thing that you might want to do for your students so you don't have to click and drag it is if you turn the animation on, it'll run through it for you and it'll trace out. Because it's moving kind of fast, it won't trace out all the points. If you want to do that, you can either make it move slower, or you can just move it manually with the arrow keys and it'll trace out more of the points. Oh, I'm being incremented by 5, so that's the problem. So we go to object properties and increment only by 1 degree now. It should trace out more. Yeah, see? It makes more of like a solid line or a curve. So now here's cosine and here's sine. So now what we want to do is we want to graph tangent. So tangent is given by our input, which is alpha, and our output, which is sine over cosine. Now we know sine over cosine is going to be y of capital C divided by x of capital C, because y of c is cosine and x of c is, y of c is sine and x of c is cosine. So I hit enter, but it graphed it in graphics 1, so I need to put it into graphics 2. So I put the trace on, and I like to make it purple because red and blue make purple. Put it in graphics 2. Okay, now it's there. Now it's right here. And as I move this, it'll trace out tangent. And that might be a little cluttered. So if you want to just show tangent, you can click off these sine and cosine. And then here's tangent. We go back to the beginning. Now one thing that's important you might want to do with your students is to make the asymptotes. So if we notice our asymptotes are going to be at values of n pi, where n is only odd numbers, see, because we're at pi, oh, not odd numbers, just increments of pi. I'm sorry, it intersects at pi, but the asymptotes are at pi over 2, right? Pi over 2, 3 pi over 2, 5 pi over 2, 7 pi over 2, so on. So now that would be like n pi over 2, where n is an odd number. So if we want asymptotes, it would be x equals, because we want a vertical line, and then 2n minus 1, but we don't have n yet. So we need to make a slider for n. So if we make a slider for n, go to integer, because it's always going to be whole numbers. We can just have this go up to 15. So now I've got a slider that moves from 1 to 15, which should have just been incremented by 1. So now I've got slides by 1. And now x equals 2n minus 1, because that'll just generate odd numbers. And GeoGebra will recognize pi just by typing in pi divided by 2. So our line here object properties, we're going to put the trace on. I'll make it black, and for style I'm going to make it like an asymptote, so it's going to be a dotted line, and advanced into graphics 2. And now if I turn the animation on this as well, since moving a little slowly, you can see it trace out the asymptotes. So now if you want, you can put them all in at once and restart it and let it go. And you will see sine and cosine and tangent be graphed with its asymptotes.